Hey everyone, my name is Nick and I'm the CEO of Doc, and it is my pleasure to be joined today by Philipp Pointner. Welcome to Identity 3, Philipp.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, our pleasure, Philipp. It'd be great starting off if you wouldn't mind letting our listeners know, Philipp, what you're currently doing within the world of identity, maybe a brief background, and then also what led you into the space.
Yeah, I'll start in reverse order maybe with the background. So I worked for a payments company for quite a while. I was in charge of multiple payment products. And then at some point regulation changed and we needed to start to do proper KYC on people. We needed to identify them. So it turned basically from an anonymous payment instrument to something that was connected to a wallet with a user attached to it. And so I actually was on the side of trying to make KYC work for consumers, and how do you give them an easy journey, and what are the obstacles. And we were asking people back then to upload their IDs, and then we had a team in-house that would just go and check these identities and try to figure out whether they're real or not. And so a few years later, then the opportunity came along for me to start working at Jumio. And I immediately knew like that's going to be a fantastic product. If we can solve that issue of onboarding and doing KYC in a smooth and easy way based on checks of government issued IDs, so moving away from the tradition of just asking the user KBA questions and these kind of things to do identity, I had a sense that would be worthwhile doing. And that's what I've been doing for the last 11 and a half years meanwhile. So I started at Jumio very early. I was employee number 10.
Wow.
I was the chief product officer for the first 9 years. And now my job is chief of digital identity to really future-proof the company for the time when it's no longer a piece of plastic. It becomes bits and bytes that live on our mobile phone.
And so your interest was really trying to make the journey, I guess, was that because having gone through that process yourself as a digital consumer, Philipp, that you experienced those frictions and that kind of was your motivation to try and make things better for others?
Yeah, and it's always been a trade-off between user convenience and kind of security and fraud fighting. And so we wanted to break that cycle and bring something that is nice and easy to use and at the same time keeps the fraudsters out. And I think this is where, digital identity also is going to be the next chapter of exactly that evolution of making it even easier or removing the process of user interaction at all. And, identity can be something that it's exchanged in the background between our devices. There are many good things in that vision for digital identity that is going to fulfill on that promise.
Yeah, and it's interesting, there's always that conflict or tension that exists between making something convenient and making something secure. And I guess as providers of solutions, we're probably always trying to get that balance, somewhere in the middle. So, it's a hard one to get exactly right. I actually read in an interview when we're doing some research for the podcast, Philipp, you said that you see the industry as, or you foresee a reusable, privacy-first, user-owned digital identity, which is quite a lot of words. Could you unpack that a little bit for us, please?
Yeah, I think the main aspect here is this reusability. So that's back to convenience. Today, if I get a new bank account at a neobank, I might get insurance online. I'm opening an account with a car sharing company. I'm renting something on any kind of any platform where goods are exchanged. I have to provide my identity, and I have to do it again and again and again, right? And so that burden is not only on the consumer, but it's also on the businesses that each have to try and figure out, well, how do we do this properly? How can we get people onboarded in a secure way? Everybody has their own implementation and their own risk platform and their own rules. And it's just the cost to society as a whole, the whole ecosystem is paying for that. And so I think even, in the European Commission, they're using terms like identity is the linchpin to unlocking kind of the next level of economy. And I fully agree. Like that is a big part of that next level of evolution. So that's the reusability part. I do it once. It gets stored in whatever format, whether this is on an operating system level on a phone, or it's a third-party app, or it's a key, whatever that form factor might take, right? But I, as a consumer, I get verified once, and then I keep building upon that verification. I add additional attributes to it. The second part is there are ways to do this that would go against the principles of privacy. So that might be a company saying, yeah, you onboard with me, I hold all your data for you, and I will share it and do with it whatever I please, right? So that idea that it has to be designed in a way that it protects the privacy of the end user, it minimizes the data that is being exchanged. The famous example that everybody always gives is when it's about, are you of a certain age? You don't need to know my name. You don't need to know where I live. You don't need to know my exact date of birth. Everything you need to know is that I am 18 or I am above 21 or whatever it might be in whatever country. And then the last piece, and this is the really interesting one, is that giving the user back the ownership of their own data and their own identity. Because when you think about it, you're sharing all this information with all kinds of companies, and then it's out there. And what happens very often with the kind of the traditional way of how identity is being done is you're not only handing over the information about you, you're also with it are shipping the proof that you are that person. So when you upload a picture of your passport, it is, yes, the information who you are, but at the same time, you've now handed over the proof point that you are that person. And so that image can, in theory, be used to open other accounts. That happens rarely, but it happens. And that's a problem. And so with digital identity, I think one of the big promises is that, yeah, I might share with you all this data about me, but the ability to prove that I am that identity stays with me. It doesn't cross over. And that's this idea of being user-owned, and for people to have the ability to revoke usage rights of their data, all of that. It's a very kind of utopian description of what digital identity can be, but I think that's where the hopes lie, that we go in that direction.
And it seems like that's an excellent answer, Philip. And it does seem like that's a fight we've been fighting for many years. Like owning your own data, whether it's like online, whether it's your social network data, all of that stuff, whether you own your own, social media, social network accounts, email accounts that are ultimately, owned by the providers of those services. Hopefully, when we overcome the challenges that surround being able to own and control your identity, of which there are a few, and we might touch on that later on in the conversation, we'll move to a much more user-centric world. So let's hope we move in that direction. You've maybe touched on some of this already in your last answer, Philip, but what do you see as the kind of next evolution in digital identity? We've kind of spoken about, being reusable and privacy focused. Are there any other aspects that you wanted to highlight?
So there are a couple of interesting dynamics. One is we've seen this push and pull and that race between the private sector and the governments trying to get to a digital identity that sees user adoption, right? And sometimes it seems like the government initiatives are ahead. Sometimes it seems like the private sector is pulling ahead. And I think right now the dynamic has shifted back to, it looks like the governments are going to be first with something that is really broadly adopted. We saw quite a lot of companies dial back a little bit their investment in the digital identity programs as part of, cost savings and just, the economics of it. But the government is plowing ahead. So we have the Digital Identity Wallet Initiative with the eIDAS-2 in Europe. We have the MDL standard that is basically, driver's licenses are issued by governments. That's a government program. We see successful deployments in Australia, in Singapore, in Brazil. They've done something very smart. They started printing QR codes on all the different versions and flavors of documents they have. So these government programs, they're really taking shape. And so I think that that's going to be kind of the first wave of adoption. Unfortunately, from an interoperability perspective, we're still going to see many pockets, right? And so good luck with using your Brazilian digital identity somewhere in Europe, and vice versa, right? So I think interoperability is the big open question there. But I see that trend now, that I think these EIDs essentially are going to be the first that get mass adopted.
An interoperability thing, I don't know how you feel about it, Philip. I sometimes feel it's kind of a bit missold by the SSI, or the decentralized identity industry. Sometimes with people attach the fact that we're maybe all using, in some cases, the Web3 consortium standards, and that's some kind of panacea for all these solutions to work together. And the reality is quite different. So I think interoperability is something for me that is very much something we should strive for, but it's still a little way off in a practical sense. Do you see that the same way?
Yeah, I fully agree with you. There are many good efforts on the way. It's always like when you talk about it, you almost can't have a conversation without it being a topic and coming up. So everybody is aware. But I think the reality is just that everybody is trying to get something on the road, and so I think where we're gonna have a lot of kind of cross-border use internationally is the MDL standard, so mobile driver's license, because it's an ISO standard that has a lot of backing from a lot of kind of the big tech companies as well. And then the other hope that I have is the EATA with the digital passport. That might be another very interesting one. So this is going to be slow. They have to make sure that all the airports in the world, all the harbors in the world, everybody is equipped, everybody has the hardware, everybody understands the processes, all the stuff is trained. So that's hard. That's real work. That's going to be slow. But they're the only ones that have this regulatory reach. They're controlling how passports are being used today and what the minimum requirements are and what information they're supposed to have and security levers. And I think if they can do the same thing for a digital passport, that's going to be really opening the world up for digital identity.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if it's maybe unfair to ask in terms of predictions, Philip, as well, but I know that the EIDAS regulation's been kind of delayed a little bit, and it's very difficult. Like you say, it's a very hard problem to solve practically, but also to legislate for is very difficult with all the different things at play. I know that there's an expectation on some of the member states within the EU that they would have solutions in place for their citizens at some point during 2024. A lot of people I've spoken with, think that's absolutely not going to happen. It's way too aggressive. Are you of the same mind, or do you have any thoughts about when that will happen?
I wish it was 2024. I don't think it is 2024. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right? The problem's being addressed. There's people working on solutions. There's progress. I think it's inevitable at this point in time. I think there's enough political will and effort put in to make this happen. And whether it's 24 or 25 won't matter that much.
It doesn't matter that much. What's a year between friends?
One of the big holdups, though, is around privacy, right? So it's this question of, should your digital identity phone home whenever you use it? That I think is one very, very important. That's a political and society level decision there, because today the government gives you your passport and then it's yours, and you take it to the hotel and you check in and you hand it over, and nobody knows that you're there, right? If you leave then, breadcrumbs all around the physical world and the digital world of wherever your identity goes, that's not good. That's not something that I think is in the interest of the consumer. And you have to keep in mind, like today, when I love this question, so I'm going to ask you, how often do you use your identity online in a year?
Well, I would say like forms of identity probably every time I log into something. So
Well, I mean, you're like KYC type, like you have to
KYC
prove who
type.
you are.
I do some work on kind of crypto exchanges and stuff, and some obviously internet banking, credit card,
But it's less
probably
than, is it less than 10?
per year.
Yeah,
Probably about 10 a year, I'd say.
about 10 a year, right? And I think that's where most people land. It's between never and 10. Like that's the kind of the range, right? I strongly believe once we get to a world of digital identity, it's going to be multiple times a day. Because your identity is going to be the underpinning of every interaction that you have online. And then that kind of leaving of breadcrumbs that I described is even worse, right? Because you could say, okay, yeah, I have these 10 places every year where I go. Don't mind if the government tracks that. But if you're using it for your daily life, to log in and connect to sites, and even you might even exchange details with websites that you visit for some reason or another. So there might be mechanisms where identity is being used to create accounts on the fly. Maybe you don't even have to have an account with a username and password anymore, because there's a way to transmit your identity in the background. Like that's the future stuff, right? That's not the first wave, but that's I think part of the promise.
Yeah, really interesting. And then kind of going back to one of the other questions I had, and you've touched on this a little bit as well, but when we spoke about the next evolution of digital identity, and we touched on some of the kind of regulation going on within Europe and the mobile driver's license stuff as well. What are some of the things that need to happen for all this to come to fruition? I guess probably at scale.
My number one, and I'm laughing because my number one always is, finally, the consumer needs to be brought on board. Like all of these initiatives, they're all academic. They're all, people trying to figure out how to solve the technology problems. That's actually where they started, right? So digital identity started out really as a technology topic. If you went to conferences, it was all about the tech and the protocols and how does this work with decentralized storage, and people trying to figure that out. That's fantastic. That's the technically underpinning, right? Then now we've seen a wave of people trying to actually get this into business applications, and trying to create, consumer-facing identity wallets and lifestyle wallets and all of these initiatives. But at the end of the day, if the end user doesn't engage and doesn't see the utility in having a digital identity, it's going to go nowhere. And that's the piece that I think is still missing. Yeah, you'll be able to log into your government services. Well, great. Is that going to be enough incentive for a mass adoption of a digital identity? I don't think so. And so that's a topic that we often think about as Jumio, is what can we bring to the table? And one of the things we think we can bring is and kind of an acceptance network, right? So if we could get all of our customers to accept a certain form of digital identity all at once, that creates a lot of usefulness to the end user, because now suddenly they get a long list of places where they can go and with one click get onboarded, and they don't have to get the driver's license out of the wallet to do it. So I think that question of what is in there for the end user, that's the biggest obstacle right now of them all. Because I think, like I said, I think in terms of technology, a lot of it is solved. The regulation is underway, at least in most places. Maybe not fast enough, but it's coming. The business applications, it's pretty clear. Like if you are a business that has to do KYC on people, like the benefit is super obvious to you, right? But I think it's the consumer that's a little bit left out on the sideline and wondering whether they should now download this identity app or not, and what's in it for them.
I think a big part of that, do you think as well, is that the user has to see the upside, and that part's quite difficult to show them. And we kind of discuss a lot, like, how do we show that, whether it's in product demos or ways that we're trying to highlight new feature releases and stuff. The thing that it can be challenging with technology and a sector that is quite new is to show users that are in many cases not necessarily particularly technical users, because it needs to be working for the masses. So it's trying to show them, not tell them, but show them the upside of this technology, whether it's reuse of already verified data, meaning they need to spend less time on a phone, or they don't need to go through some arduous KYC check. I think that's a big barrier. Would you say the same thing, Philipp? And how much is UX a factor in getting people, at scale into these systems?
Yeah, and so I mean, as an old school product guy, I would say it's back to the kind of the basics of product management. I think there needs to be a user group that can be however small, right, that gets an immediate benefit out of this, right? And then we need to make sure that these users, they love it and they use it more and becomes more useful for them. And then we can move on to the next user group. I think this catch-all, be-all, I'm going to cover the entire population at the same time is just futile. That's just not going to happen unless there is a really big incentive. There are examples of this, right? So I remember when in Australia, they've introduced I forgot the name of the card, but there's the card that you use to kind of use all of public transport, right? And it's automatically built to your bank account, and you can use every public transport system all across, right? That's great. People signed up, people had the card back then, later on the app, right? Because that's huge utility that you use every day. If something like this comes up, then yeah, it's possible to kind of capture a whole population at the same time. But in the absence of it, we have to kind of dial it down a little bit and think about, well, what maybe it's immigrants, maybe it's people that within Europe move from one country to another. Maybe it's around schools and universities. So there are many use cases that one can think about that can make it successful. But I think there needs to be like a laser focus on a certain user group and really try to understand them and their needs and see whether it makes sense for them.
Yeah, I know the EBSI in Europe is focused a lot on the student use case and how identity and credentialing in addition can impact positively on students. Particularly the use case that's brought up a lot is how they can move around European partner universities and not need to re-register every single time, and for the student to be able to control their own learnings so far, so that when they go to a different university, they control that information and they can pass it along. I think it's still at pilot stage, or though, like many of those projects. So, but I know that they're certainly looking at that. One of the other things that you said as well, Philipp, that I think that you said, and I interpreted it a certain way, was that organizational identity, we're seeing that now, like really businesses and users of businesses, wanting these services and understanding how decentralized identity can fit into that. And we've kind of worked that way at Doc for a while. I've also seen kind of pretty influential people in the space. I think Timothy Ruff of Evernym, or formerly of Evernym, he's talked a lot about organizational identity being really active right now as well. Is that something that you were meaning when you were talking about organizational identity? Are you guys seeing that as being important right now?
So there's two sides of what a business needs, right? One is to turn strangers into customers, and then the other one is their own employees. And I think maybe what he meant is the employee side. There are very large multinational corporations that are still, there's good technology out there, but there are still problems to be solved in that area. And I think this is where, digital identity, and especially decentralized, where the user is doing the carrying, right? They're moving from one place to another, and you don't have to have connection to a centralized system. I think that's the key part for these use cases, right? And so that tokenization of identity that can stay with the user and still be verified in a secure way, that's a very interesting need. Because from a consumer perspective, you typically just onboard once with a business, right? And so that's it. That's your onboarding journey. Then you are known, and then it's more about ongoing monitoring and authentication. So should I let you log in the next time? Is it really you? And are you behaving in a way that fits your normal behavioral pattern, and doesn't indicate that it's account takeover or something, right? And so that's usually the life cycle that you have for a consumer. But for an employee, it's much different. They might go to different locations. If they are moving between departments, they get, and especially if you have a business that is attached to the physical world, where there are truck drivers and warehouses, and then it's open, and we're only obviously here talking about people identity. Like when we go into that whole kind of logistics and identity of parcels and packages and whatnot, that's a whole world by its own.
Yeah, I suppose as well you can even get like trade finance is an often cited use case where like organizations who are maybe looking for funding for a shipment or something like that because they don't have the money to pay for it at that point in time. They need to sell the goods in order to pay for the shipment and get things moving. They're often needing to go through checks on them as a business. So I guess it would have, has the potential to impact, the world of trade finance, which is quite sizable. Which actually brings me nicely onto a question: how will reusable identity impact organizations? You talked a little bit about supply chain as well. Are there other use cases, Philip, that you think is?
I think it's going to just significantly drop the price of onboarding a user. And we talk to a lot of businesses that would love to understand the real world identity of their users, but it's just currently unaffordable in the business model. Let's say any questions and answers board on the internet, right? So to rein in trolling, hate speech, some regulatory problems, they would love for everybody to post under their real name, and to understand who everybody is, but they just can't. It's cost prohibitive. They cannot verify everybody who comes to their site. It just doesn't pay off, right? And so if then you have a reusable identity where at the click of a button, information can be exchanged at a much, much lower cost, that's going to open up a huge new market of using identity. When you think about, this huge industry of online gaming, video games, right? They're always fighting against account takeover and accounts being hacked and goods are being stolen and sold off, and I don't know what kind of abuse exists in that world, but that they would love to kind of be able to identify someone who says, I've been locked out of my account, I would like to get back in. So having an identifier that sits with the end user in that decentralized manner would be extremely useful there. But again, no, we don't want to burden our users in that way. It costs too much money. It's too big of an implementation and maintenance effort. So all of that gets solved with a good digital identity system. And so I think that's where we're going to see the biggest shift, is that there are going to be so many more places where we can use our identities, where currently it's a nice to have, but just not affordable.
This brings me on to my last question, although I've kind of got a second question hidden in here, so it's a bit of a cheat. But so for organizations that maybe they've been listening to this conversation and they're looking to dig a little bit deeper to the point where they're actually considering implementing a digital identity system, what are some of the fundamental elements that their framework should include, Philip, that you'd recommend to them?
So I think first of all, I think people need to kind of get that line of, you can be on the acceptance side or you can be on the issuing side, right? And I very often use the analogy of the payment system, where on the one hand, you have the banks and institutions that are handing out the bank accounts and the credit cards, and then you have places, well, let's stick with the credit card analogy. Then you have places where you can use them. And that's the acceptance network, right? And if you remember in the old days, you would walk up to a store and you would there were stickers outside and you would check if your card is being accepted in a certain store. Like today, we all kind of assume that everything's accepted everywhere. But it wasn't a given that credit card is taken in the first place, and then maybe it's the wrong brand or whatever. And so I think that's a bit the future that we'll see here, is that you'll have a certain digital identity, but then where can I use it, right? So that's the acceptance side of it. So businesses will need to make smart decisions about how and which identities they want to accept, right? And this is, I think, where a little bit companies like Jumio come in to help and curate a little bit and give advice. But overall, the question will be, is this compliant with my regulation? Can I, as a business, even accept digital identities? We still see regulation being very much behind on this. So that's the first question we always get from customers. Oh, digital identity. Well, wait a second. Are we even allowed to use this? Right? And then in many countries, banks, for example, they have to file their KYC process and be very specific about what they do and what documents they accept and which vendors they use. And so digital identity acceptance would force them to file again with the regulator and say, and also we are now accepting the following digital identities. And that's a big process, filing these kind of processes with the regulator. So being clear about what you want to accept and what does that really mean for your business in terms of compliance. And then also understanding, and that's also a tricky part, like what assurance level does a certain digital identity come with? Who has created it and why? And was it, is it based on a passport or driver's license that was authenticated and then converted into a digital identity? Or is this a digital first identity, like an EID that the government would give out? Like that's where I think people need to get a little bit of education and become more sophisticated on, not everything is digital. It's not just one bucket. There are nuances. So that's on the acceptance side. And then on the issuing side, I think that, with services and companies like yours, it's going to become, or is already, very easy to start issuing credentials for later reuse. And one of the prime examples was the buy now, pay later, right? They're one level removed from the customer. You as a consumer typically don't have an account with them. You don't have that direct relationship. You don't know their name maybe. But it would be great if your record and the fact that you're already KYC'd and the fact that you are creditworthy and all of that can stay with you, so that when next time you go and finance something, your next iPhone or whatever, you can reuse that. So if companies have this need of, I would like to give the user something that stays with them, but I can verify it and have the proof that I have issued this afterwards, then that's where they can look for solutions and there are turnkey solutions now where you just basically, you connect over some simple APIs, you start issuing credentials in a week, right? And what I think there is the problem, like these use cases haven't really breached through the surface yet. So I at least haven't seen this particular industry, this use case, it's a must now to do credential issuing. Like that hasn't really happened yet outside of government. But I can think of use cases, like I just said, buy now, pay later, healthcare, another great one, right? Or any site that wants to verify consumers' age, but they don't want to hold a record or an account for that consumer. So age verification, I think, might be another use case. So they're out there, but we haven't seen big adoption on that issuing case now. But I think getting that clarity around, am I on the acceptance side? Am I just passively here trying to accept people's identity? Or do I have a use case where I want to become part of the issuing process? That's something that businesses need to get clear about.
No, I agree as well, Philip. The other thing that we're seeing as well is VCs, or verifiable credentials, I should say, not necessarily implicitly just by themselves, being used just for identity proof outside like government use cases, like you mentioned, but actually complementing other forms of identity is something that we're starting to see. So I know that things like NIST in the US, I think there's I forget the name of the UK based one, but they have these kind of not standards, but I guess kind of recommendations, that a way that they want people to work. And they're actually looking for multi-factor authentication in order to provide potentially, prove you're the owner of something, and then the verifiable credential or another form of identity can be used to actually prove your identity. So we're actually seeing maybe verifiable credentials and decentralized identity being coupled with other things like biometrics in order to, give more security, but not necessarily just by themselves. So I think we're starting to see that happen quite often. And if you get bigger, like things like NIST happening, that's certainly hopefully a shot in the arm for the industry if that starts to scale up.
Yeah, and I think there's two more thoughts on this. One is, I think when we're always stuck with this person identity, right? But it's not just who you are, it's what permits do you have professionally? What's your, verified residential address? Maybe a verified phone and a verified email address that you can pass on to people. It might be, credentials that are tied to your workplace that only your workplace can see, that you're not necessarily open to share with others, right? So I think as more and more information aggregates around your profile, it becomes then more useful for the end user. So I think that's a big point there. And then last but not least, like you said, it's on the more that identity can run on the existing rails, the better it's going to be. And so I think there's the where we want it to be in the end, where it's a pure digital identity, and it may be you don't have an image of your passport stored in your digital identity anymore. It's just a verified set of data. But today, back to compliance, many banks, they tell us like, no, I need the image on file because that's my process, right? And so maybe that's, to your point of maybe it's digital identity paired with some of the other aspects. So maybe you still share and ship your image of your passport for the moment with all the negative effects that has, and you kind of skip the verification process because you have the verifiable credential to back it up, that it's authentic and it's been looked at, and you back it up maybe with your EID that matches your passport, however that scenario works, right? But I think that idea of, no, we're going to create a completely new system that sits outside of what is being done today isn't going to work. We have to run on the existing rails. And then at one point, I'm sure that, that final stage can be reached where we're not exchanging pixels anymore.
That's a great point to finish on, actually, Philip. I don't have any more questions for you. I think I've really, really enjoyed the discussion. And I think you've illustrated kind of your side of the industry extremely well. Are there any other questions or any kind of other thoughts that you want to put over before we wrap up?
No, I think just people should be patient with digital identity. That's my big message out there is it's coming. There's many people working on this. There's political will there. Businesses are learning. it's going to be a while, but I think the reward on the other side is going to be really good for society as a whole.
I agree. Couldn't have said it better. Thanks again, Philip, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.